The lamplight flickered against sweating stone walls, casting dancing shadows that reminded Boone Calder too much of another cellar. Another night, 3 years ago, when he'd found his 8-year-old daughter Sarah's body in a similar darkness. The memory hit him like a fist to the gut as he watched the scene unfold in the basement of Willow Creek's Roaring Mule Saloon. 2 figures chained to the wall like livestock awaiting slaughter. Sister Magdalena Ward knelt in blood-stained white robes, her dark hair escaping its pins to frame a face that bore intelligence beneath the grime. Beside her crouched a small girl, maybe 8 years old, with pale blue eyes that held the same hollow terror Boone had seen in his daughter's face during those final moments. The child's silence was absolute, unnatural, the kind of quiet that came from witnessing unspeakable things. "Gentlemen, tonight we traffic in the exotic." Dutch Penrose's voice carried the theatrical flair of a carnival barker, his gold teeth glinting as he gestured toward the prisoners. Lot 1, a holy woman fresh from God's embrace. Lot 2, a mute little dove perfect for those with particular tastes. Boone pressed deeper into the shadows near the cellar's stone stairs, his scarred hands steady despite the rage building in his chest. He'd tracked Eli Ironhand Voss across 4 territories, following a trail of disappeared women and children that led inevitably to this godforsaken town. The $5,000 bounty on Voss's head had been motivation enough, but seeing this child Sarah's age, Sarah's terror made it personal. The crowd of buyers numbered maybe 20 men, their faces illuminated by the hellish glow of oil lamps. Merchants who should have known better, ranch hands with more money than morals, drifters who'd found their way to the bottom of humanity's barrel. They shifted and muttered, studying their potential purchases with the casual interest of men shopping for cattle. Boone had spent 2 weeks establishing his cover identity, Jake Morrison, representing certain San Francisco interests with deep pockets and flexible morals. The forged credentials in his jacket had cost him 3 months' worth of bounties, but they'd gotten him this far. Now came the hardest part, playing the role, while his every instinct screamed to start shooting. "Now, boys." Dutch continued, mopping nervous sweat from his brow. "Our esteemed patron Mr. Voss himself has expressed interest in tonight's merchandise. So let's conduct ourselves with appropriate respect." A ripple of uneasy laughter went through the crowd. Everyone in Willow Creek knew what respect meant when it came to Eli Voss. It meant keeping your mouth shut, your eyes down, and your hands where he could see them. The cellar door creaked open, and conversations died like candle flames in a sudden wind. Heavy boots descended the stairs with measured precision, each step deliberate as a drumbeat. Eli Voss appeared like something from a fever dream. Tall, broad-shouldered, immaculately dressed in black silk that probably cost more than most men earned in a year. His infamous iron hand gleamed in the lamplight, a mechanical masterpiece of gears and springs that had replaced whatever flesh and bone had been there before. His good hand rested casually on the pearl grip of a Colt .45 that looked like it had seen considerable use. "Oh, gentlemen," Voss said, and his voice carried the quiet authority of a man who'd never been contradicted without consequences. "Please don't let my presence interrupt your commerce." Boone watched the child's reaction to Voss's voice, the way she seemed to shrink into herself, her small body going rigid with recognition and terror. There was history there, something deeper than a stranger's fear. The sister's eyes tracked to the stairs, calculating distances and angles with the cold precision of someone far more worldly than her habit suggested. "Lot 1 opens at $50. Dutch announced, but his theatrical confidence had evaporated in Voss's presence. The bidding began tentatively, men calling out numbers while gauging their host's reaction. 50 became 70, became 90. Boone let others reveal their hands, first watching, learning, waiting for the right moment to make his play. 100 called a voice from the back, a thin man in an expensive suit who kept glancing nervously at Voss. 120. Boone said quietly, stepping slightly forward so the lamplight caught his face. He'd spent hours perfecting the expression casual confidence mixed with just enough menace to suggest serious money and flexible morals. All eyes turned toward him. He let a slow smile spread across his scarred features, tipping his hat to acknowledge the attention. 150, the thin man countered, but his voice wavered. 200, Boone replied, pulling out a roll of bills thick enough to draw sharp intakes of breath from several observers. The bidding stalled. $200 represented serious money in this part of the territory, enough to buy a good horse and saddle or stock a small ranch. For most men in that cellar, it was more than they'd see in months. Sold to Mr. Morrison. Dutch began clearly relieved to conclude the proceedings, but Voss raised his iron hand. Not quite Mr. Penrose. Voss stepped forward, his pale eyes sweeping the room like a predator marking territory. $500 for both lots. The cellar fell silent except for the sound of breathing and the distant piano music filtering down from the saloon above. $500 was a fortune enough to buy land or start a business. Sir, Dutch stammered, the bidding for Lot 2 hasn't even... I want them together. Voss's gaze never wavered. No witnesses, no loose ends. I trust that's understood. Boone watched Sister Magdalena's hand, find the child's offering what comfort she could. The girl flinched slightly at Voss's approach, her terrified gaze darting toward Boone with something that might have been hope. This was it, the moment that would make or break his carefully constructed cover. Boone affected the lazy confidence of a man accustomed to getting his way. Well, now, Mr. Voss, that's mighty generous of you. He drawled, leaning against a support beam with studied casualness. But I'm afraid my employers in San Francisco were quite specific about their requirements. He paused, letting the silence build. They've authorized me to go as high as $1,000 for the pair. A collective gasp went through the crowd. $1,000 was land-buying money, life-changing money. It was the kind of sum that could elevate a man from poverty to prosperity overnight. Voss studied Boone with predatory intensity. Your employers, the consortium. Boone said, using the fictional organization he'd carefully crafted for this moment. Certain gentlemen in San Francisco with specialized interests. They've heard about your operation here and are quite impressed. In fact, they'd like to discuss expanding your market reach. The lie was perfectly calibrated. Voss was smart enough to recognize the limitations of his current operation, ambitious enough to want more, and greedy enough to take risks for the right price. The prospect of expansion into California's wealthy cities would appeal to both his avarice and his ego. A partnership. Voss repeated slowly, his mechanical fingers clicking against each other in a rhythmic pattern that suggested deep thought. Indeed. Perhaps we could discuss the details privately. I believe we have much to offer each other. Boone could see the calculation in Voss's eyes, greed warring with caution, ambition battling suspicion. The moment stretched taut as a bowstring, until finally avarice won. Voss nodded curtly. Dutch, clear the room. Mr. Morrison and I have business to discuss. As the crowd filed out grumbling about the interrupted auction, Boone caught Sister Magdalena's eye. Her gaze was steady, intelligent, evaluating him as carefully as he was evaluating the situation. Whatever secrets she carried beneath that habit, she was nobody's helpless victim. The last buyer climbed the stairs, leaving only Boone, Voss, Dutch, and two of Voss's gunmen in the cellar with the prisoners. The lamplight seemed dimmer now, the shadows deeper and more menacing. Now then, Voss said, settling into a chair that Dutch hastily provided, tell me about this consortium of yours. Boone launched into his carefully prepared story, wealthy men in San Francisco, with interests in exotic entertainment private clubs, where discretion was valued above all else. Money that flowed like water for those who could provide unique services. As he spoke, he began pacing with apparent nervous energy, gradually moving closer to the prisoners. The initial investment would be substantial. Boone was saying, but the returns. He let the sentence hang as he dropped a small folding knife near Sister Magdalena's bound hands, the motion hidden by his shadow, and the dramatic gesture of his other arm. Her fingers found the blade, instantly palming it, without the slightest change in expression. Whatever her background, she was no stranger to weapons or deception. "And what guarantee?" Voss asked, leaning back in his chair. "Do I have that your consortium isn't simply a front for federal marshals or Pinkerton agents?" Boone had expected this question. He reached slowly into his jacket and produced the leather folder containing his forged credentials. "Marcus Webb, Treasury Department," he said, handing over the documents. "I've been investigating tax irregularities in certain San Francisco establishments. What I've discovered is that some very wealthy men are looking for ways to diversify their investments in regions where federal oversight is limited." The credentials were masterwork forgeries, complete with official seals and signatures that would fool anyone not intimately familiar with actual Treasury Department procedures. Voss studied them with the intensity of a man whose life depended on spotting deception. After several long minutes, he handed them back with a grunt that might have been approval. "Impressive documentation," he admitted. "But I didn't survive this long by trusting papers that can be forged or men who appear at convenient moments." That's when Boone knew his cover was blown. Voss nodded almost imperceptibly to his gunman. Suddenly, Boone found himself staring down the barrels of 2 Colts, held by men with the dead eyes of professional killers. "A Dutch escort our federal friend upstairs and secure him in the back room," Voss commanded. "I need to consider how best to handle this complication." "Now hold on." Boone started, but one of the gunmen, a scarred brute with tobacco-stained teeth, pressed his pistol against Boone's temple hard enough to leave a mark. "Move," the gunman said simply. As they forced him toward the stairs, Boone heard Voss addressing his remaining men with chilling calm. "Unload the merchandise into the wagon. We're taking them to the old chapel. It's time to eliminate some loose ends permanently." Boone's blood turned to ice water. The abandoned chapel outside town was where bodies disappeared forever, where Voss disposed of problems that couldn't be solved with intimidation or bribery. If he was moving the prisoners there, he wasn't planning to sell them, he was planning to kill them. They shoved him into a windowless storage room above the saloon and barred the door from outside. Boone immediately began examining his prison, searching for weaknesses. The walls were solid timber, the door heavy oak reinforced with iron strips. But the ceiling was nothing but pine planks, aged and dried by years of desert heat. Using his belt buckle as a pry bar, Boone began working on the boards above his head. The wood creaked and protested, but desperation gave him strength. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, he managed to loosen one plank enough to squeeze through into the cramped space between floors. The area between ceiling and floor was a maze of support beams and accumulated dust, but Boone had crawled through worse. He followed the sound of voices until he found a loose board that gave him a view of the main saloon below. Most of the room was empty now, but behind the bar, a woman was methodically cleaning glasses. Annie Sawyer had been working the Roaring Mule for 15 years since before Voss's rise to power. She was maybe 40, weathered by hard living, but still handsome in a stern way. More importantly, she was one of the few people in Willow Creek who remembered what the town had been like before Voss's reign of terror. Boone managed to loosen the floorboard enough to drop down behind the bar. Annie looked up at him without surprise, as if men regularly fell from her ceiling. "You're that bounty hunter," she said quietly, never pausing in her methodical glass polishing. "The one who's been asking the right questions to the wrong people. You know who I am. I know what you are. And I know what that bastard just loaded into his wagon." Her hands never stopped moving, but her knuckles were white where she gripped the glass. "That little girl reminds me of my Emma. Would be about her age now if she'd lived." "What happened to your daughter?" Annie's jaw tightened. "Voss happened 3 years ago when I tried to leave town with her. He said no one leaves Willow Creek without his permission. Her voice remained steady, but tears tracked down her weathered cheeks. Found her body in Miller's Creek 2 days later. Official story was she wandered off and drowned. Boone felt that familiar cold fury settle in his chest, the same rage that had driven him to hunt monsters like Voss across half the territory. I'm sorry for your loss. Don't be sorry. Do something. Annie reached under the bar and produced a gun belt. This belonged to my husband. He tried to stand up to Voss 5 years ago. Didn't end well for him either. The weapon was a well-maintained Colt .44 clean and recently oiled. Boone strapped it on, checking the cylinder. 6 bullets. It would have to be enough. There's a back door through the kitchen, Annie said, pointing toward a curtained doorway. Your horse is behind Garrett's blacksmith shop. I had my boy Tommy move it there an hour ago. The chapel's about 2 miles north past Miller's Creek. Why are you helping me? Annie finally looked at him directly, and he saw something in her eyes that he recognized, the cold, patient fury of someone who'd lost everything and had nothing left to lose except the chance for justice. Because that little girl deserves better than what my Emma got. And because... She hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. Because I've been feeding you information for 2 weeks, and if Voss finds out, I'm a dead woman anyway. Boone stared at her. You're my contact, the one who's been leaving messages at the hotel. Who else would know Voss's schedule, his habits, his weaknesses? I've been watching him for 3 years, waiting for someone like you to show up. Annie's smile was sharp as a blade. You think it was coincidence that you learned about tonight's auction, that you knew exactly when and where to be. The pieces fell into place with stunning clarity. The carefully timed intelligence, the perfect opportunities to observe Voss's operation, the convenient gaps in security that had allowed Boone to infiltrate the organization, all of it orchestrated by a grieving mother with infinite patience and a thirst for justice. Annie, if he suspects, he already suspects. Saw it in his eyes tonight when he looked at me after your little performance downstairs. That's why I'm helping you escape instead of maintaining my cover. She pulled a shotgun from beneath the bar and checked its loads. I'm done hiding, done waiting. Tonight ends it one way or another. Outside, the night air was crisp and clean after the fetid atmosphere of the cellar. Boone's horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Ranger, whickered softly as he approached. Someone had already saddled him and secured his rifle in its scabbard. As he swung into the saddle, Boone heard the distant sound of wagon wheels on hard-packed earth. Voss was already moving, taking his prisoners to their death. Every second counted now. The ride to the old chapel seemed to take forever, though Boone pushed Ranger hard through the darkness. The building came into view just as storm clouds began gathering overhead, blotting out the stars. The chapel had been abandoned for years, its white paint weathered to gray, its bell tower listing slightly to one side, like a drunk trying to maintain dignity. But lamplight flickered in the windows, and several horses were tied to the hitching post outside. Boone left Ranger tied to a mesquite bush about 100 yards away, and approached on foot. Through a cracked window, he could see into the chapel's main room. Sister Magdalena and the child sat in the front pew, no longer shackled, but surrounded by armed men. Voss stood near the altar, speaking in low tones to Dutch Penrose. The body language was clear. Voss was giving orders. Dutch was nodding nervously, and the gunmen were checking their weapons. This was preparation for execution, not negotiation. Boone needed to get closer, but the chapel's windows were too high and too exposed. The only other entrance was through the bell tower, which meant climbing 20 feet of rickety ladder in full view of anyone who looked up. That's when he noticed the old cemetery behind the chapel. The graveyard was small, maybe 30 headstones arranged in neat rows on a slight hill. More importantly, several of the older graves had been built with family crypts, stone structures large enough to hide a man. And if this chapel followed the pattern of other frontier churches, there would be a tunnel connecting the cemetery to the building's basement, originally built to allow discreet burial of plague victims or casualties of violence. Finding the tunnel entrance took precious minutes of searching among the weathered headstones. It was concealed beneath a false bottom in the largest mausoleum, sealed with a stone slab that required all of Boone's strength to move. The tunnel itself was narrow, carved from living rock and shored up with rotting timber. It reeked of decay and stagnant water, but it led directly toward the chapel. As Boone crawled through the claustrophobic darkness, he could hear voices echoing through the stone above. Skana can't simply disappear them without explanation. Dutch was saying, his voice tight with nervous energy. People will ask questions, especially about the nun. The church will send investigators. People will ask the questions I permit them to ask. Voss replied with chilling calm. As for the church, Sister Magdalena was traveling alone through dangerous territory. Tragic accidents happen all the time out here. What about Morrison? His people in San Francisco will expect contact. Morrison is a federal agent despite his impressive credentials. I'm certain of it now. His story was too convenient, his documentation too perfect. Someone's been feeding him intelligence about our operations. Boone reached the end of the tunnel, where a rusted iron grate blocked his path. Through the bars, he could see into the chapel's stone basement, a chamber that had probably once stored wine or grain, but now held something far more sinister. Wooden barrels were stacked against one wall, marked with the familiar crossed hammer symbol of blasting powder. Enough explosive to bring down the entire building and everyone in it. Voss's cleanup plan was becoming clear. Burn the evidence, collapse the structure, claim it was an accident caused by old mining equipment left by previous occupants. The perfect way to eliminate witnesses and destroy any proof of his crimes. The grate was secured with a rusty padlock, but the metal was old and corroded. Boone used his knife to work at the mechanism, slowly teasing the lock open. It was delicate work that required patience he didn't have, but rushing would create noise that would alert the guards above. Finally, the lock clicked open and the grate swung free with a barely audible creak. Boone squeezed through into the basement, immediately looking for access to the upper level. Stone steps led to a wooden door that probably opened into the chapel's main floor, but as he approached the stairs, he heard something that made his blood run cold. "Josie." It was Voss's voice, but softer now, almost gentle. "Look at me, child." Through the floorboards above, Boone could hear movement and the creak of pew wood, the sound of someone standing. "I know you haven't spoken since the fire," Voss continued. "But you understand me, don't you? You know who I am." Silence. Then Sister Magdalena's voice, sharp with protective fury. "Leave her alone. She's suffered enough already." "On the contrary, sister. Her suffering has only just begun. You see, gentlemen," Voss was explaining to his men, "this child represents a complication I should have resolved years ago. Her mother was an indiscretion, a moment of weakness that produced an inconvenient reminder of my humanity." "You're talking about your own daughter," Magdalena said, and her voice carried the deadly calm of someone preparing for violence. "I'm talking about a mistake that needs correcting. You can't build an empire while dragging the baggage of sentiment behind you." Boone crept up the stairs and eased the door open just enough to see into the chapel. Voss stood near the altar, his iron hand reflecting lamplight as his mechanical fingers clicked together in that rhythmic pattern. Sister Magdalena had positioned herself protectively between Voss and the child who sat motionless in the front pew, her winter blue eyes fixed on the man who had murdered her adoptive parents. Dutch and 3 gunmen flanked the prisoners while a 4th man stood guard at the main entrance. Bad odds, but Boone had faced worse. He was preparing to make his move when he saw something that changed everything. Sister Magdalena's right hand was moving slowly, carefully toward something concealed in the folds of her habit. Her left hand gestured as she spoke, drawing attention away from her right. It was classic misdirection, the kind used by card sharps and professional killers. "She's your blood," Magdalena was saying. "Doesn't that mean anything to you?" "Blood is a weakness," Voss replied coldly. "It makes men sentimental careless. I've built my empire by eliminating weaknesses." "Then you're not a man at all? You're just a beast wearing human skin." That's when Boone saw what Magdalena had been reaching for, a derringer, small and deadly, concealed in a specially sewn pocket of her habit. But Voss saw it too. His iron hand moved with mechanical precision, striking her across the face before she could draw the weapon. She stumbled backward, the derringer clattering across the stone floor. The child made a sound, the first sound Boone had heard from her, a soft whimper of distress as she reached toward the fallen woman. "Touching," Voss said, "but futile. Dutch, start spreading the coal oil. It's time to end this charade." That's when Boone kicked open the door and came up shooting. His first shot took down the guard at the entrance before the man could even turn. His second sent Dutch diving for cover behind a pew, the can of coal oil flying from his hands to splash across the stone floor. "Federal Marshal," Boone shouted, hoping to buy confusion and precious seconds. Everyone on the ground. One of Voss's gunmen spun toward the new threat, his weapon clearing leather with practiced speed. But Boone had been in more gunfights than he could count, and his third shot punched through the man's chest before he could fire. The remaining two gunmen were smarter, using the chapel's stone pillars for cover, while they returned fire. Bullets chipped stone and splintered wood as Boone rolled behind the altar looking for a better position. Through the chaos, he saw Sister Magdalena moving with fluid grace, no longer the helpless victim, but a predator unleashed. She'd retrieved her derringer and was herding the child toward the chapel's side door, but Voss was tracking them with his own weapon drawn. Boone had a clear shot at Voss's back, but taking it would expose him to the gunmen behind the pillars. Split-second decision: eliminate the primary threat or save the innocents. He chose to save the innocents. His fourth shot splintered wood inches from Voss's head, spoiling his aim and giving Magdalena the seconds she needed to reach the door. But it also gave one of the gunmen a clear shot at Boone. The bullet creased his left shoulder, spinning him around and sending his return fire wide. The gunman advanced confidently, his Colt steady in a two-handed grip. "Drop it, Marshal. You're outgunned and outmanned." Boone still had 2 bullets left, but his shoulder was on fire and his gun hand was shaking from the impact. Across the chapel, Dutch was fumbling with another can of oil, trying to follow Voss's orders despite the gunfire. Then the side door burst open and Sister Magdalena returned. She wasn't running anymore. She moved like a professional, her torn habit billowing as she advanced with the derringer in one hand and a wicked-looking stiletto in the other, probably found in the same cache as the small gun. The advancing gunman turned toward this new threat, and Boone put his 5th bullet through the man's spine. But the last gunman had flanked them, coming around the far side of the chapel, with his weapon trained on Magdalena. Boone's final bullet took him in the shoulder, spinning him around, but not dropping him. The wounded man's shot went wide, but Dutch had finally managed to light one of the oil-soaked fuses leading to the basement. Sparks began racing toward the blasting powder below. "Sister," Boone called out, struggling to reload. "Where's the child?" "Safe outside," Magdalena replied, advancing on the wounded gunman with her blade ready. "For now." The injured man tried to bring his gun to bear, but Magdalena's stiletto found his throat before he could fire. He fell backward, clutching his neck as blood spread across the stone floor. But Dutch had lit a second fuse, and now there were multiple lines of sparks racing toward the basement. The chapel was about to become a tomb for all of them. "We need to get out of here," Boone said, finally managing to reload his revolver. "Not without finishing this." Magdalena turned toward Voss, who had taken cover behind the altar during the firefight. "Elena." Voss's voice carried a familiarity that made Boone's blood run cold. "I should have known you'd survived. You always were too stubborn to die easy." "Elena, not Magdalena." "Hello, Eli," she replied, raising her derringer. "Miss me?" The pieces clicked into place with stunning clarity. Elena had once been part of Voss's organization, close enough to know his real name, his methods, his weaknesses. Close enough to betray him when she learned the full extent of his depravity. "You made one mistake," Voss said, his iron hand clicking as he prepared to draw. "You should have stayed dead." "I tried, but some sins demand justice." They faced each other across the oil-slicked floor, predator and prey hunter, and hunted former allies, now mortal enemies. The fuses continued to burn, sending sparks racing toward inevitable destruction. Then a small figure appeared in the doorway. The child, Josie, stood silhouetted against the night, no longer the terrified, silent victim from the auction. Her pale blue eyes were steady now, focused, and in her small hands was Boone's rifle taken from his horse's scabbard. The weapon was almost as big as she was, but she held it with both hands, and the barrel pointed directly at Voss's heart. For a moment, the chapel was completely silent, except for the hissing of burning fuses. Then Josie spoke. Her first words in months, maybe years, came out as a whisper that somehow carried clearly through the stone chamber. "Why did you kill my mama and papa?" Voss froze, his attention fixed entirely on the child, pointing a rifle at his chest. For just an instant, his guard dropped his iron hand, lowering, as if the weight of his crimes had finally become too much to bear. In that instant, Elena put her Derringer's bullet between his ribs. Voss staggered backward, looking down at the spreading bloodstain with something like surprise. But he wasn't finished. His iron hand came up, mechanical fingers spreading like a metal spider as he reached for his fallen weapon. Boone's shot took him in the head. Eli Iron Hand Voss, terror of Willow Creek and butcher of innocents, fell like a toppled monument, his iron hand clattering against stone as his body hit the floor. But the fuses were still burning, multiple lines of sparks, racing toward enough blasting powder to level half the hill. "Move!" Boone shouted, scooping up Josie while Elena grabbed her weapons. They ran for the side door as the hissing from below grew louder, more urgent. Behind them, Dutch's spilled coal oil was spreading across the floor, and somewhere in the walls, additional fuses were beginning to catch fire. Outside, storm clouds had opened up, releasing the first drops of what promised to be a torrential downpour. They sprinted toward the cemetery, looking for cover among the headstones. There... Elena pointed toward a depression between two large grave monuments. "It's not much, but..." The explosion cut off her words. The chapel erupted like a volcano, stone and timber blasting outward in a mushroom cloud of fire and debris. The bell tower toppled, its bronze bell tolling once as it crashed to earth. Windows exploded in showers of glass that caught the firelight like deadly stars. Boone threw himself over Josie, feeling the heat wash over them like dragon's breath. Chunks of stone rained down, along with burning timber and pieces of what had once been pews and altar rails. When the echoes finally died away, the chapel was gone. In its place was a crater filled with smoking rubble and scattered fires that the rain was slowly extinguishing. "Jesus." Boone breathed, sitting up and checking Josie for injuries. She seemed unhurt, though her dress was torn and muddy. "Language," Elena said automatically, then caught herself with a rueful smile. "Old habits." She was bleeding from a cut on her forehead, and her right wrist was swelling where Voss's iron hand had struck her. But she was alive, and so were they all. "We need to get back to town," Boone said, helping them both to their feet. "Voss had men there, and when they hear about this, they'll run like rats from a burning barn," Elena finished. "Men like that are only loyal as long as the money flows, and the boss seems invincible. With Voss dead, his empire dies with him." She was right. Boone had seen it before, criminal organizations that collapsed overnight when their leadership was eliminated. Fear was a powerful motivator, but it was also fragile. Once broken, it was almost impossible to rebuild, but he still had questions that needed answers. "Elena," he said, using the name Voss had called her. She looked at him steadily, rain streaming down her face. "That was a long time ago." "How long?" 5 years. I rode with Voss's gang for 8 months before I understood what he really was, what he was building. She pulled back her habit, revealing rope scars on her neck. When I tried to leave, he had me hanged, left me for dead in the desert. But you survived. Barely. A priest named Father Miguel found me, nursed me back to health, gave me sanctuary and a new identity. Her voice hardened. Voss killed him 2 years ago when Miguel started asking questions about missing children. And you became Sister Magdalena. I became what I needed to become to survive. The habit was protection, who suspects a nun of being a former outlaw, but it was also penance, a way to balance the scales for what I'd done. Boone looked at Josie, who was standing quietly between them, her small hands folded despite the chaos they'd just survived. And I found her after Voss burned down her family's farm outside Tucson. Her adoptive parents were dead, then the house was in flames, and she was hiding in the root cellar. She hasn't spoken since that night, until now. Why did she call him out, ask about her parents? Elena knelt beside the child, gently brushing mud from her face. Because she deserved to know the truth. And because even monsters should face their victims before they die. They made their way back toward town. Through the rain, a strange little family forged in violence and bound by shared survival. Behind them, the fires at the chapel gradually died under the storm's assault, leaving only smoking ruins and the promise of justice finally served. As they crested the hill overlooking Willow Creek, they could see lights blazing in the town below. Not the usual scattered glow of evening activities, but the organized illumination of people gathering in the streets. Word of the explosion had traveled fast, and the town was coming awake like a giant stirring from fearful sleep. "Look," Josie said suddenly, pointing toward the main street. It was the second time she'd spoken in years, and her voice was stronger now, more confident. Following her gesture, they could see riders leaving town at a gallop, dark figures fleeing into the night like shadows before dawn. Voss's men, Elena observed with satisfaction, abandoning ship before it sinks completely. They were met at the town's edge by Annie Sawyer, mounted on a sturdy mare and leading a small group of armed townspeople. Her face was grim but determined, and she carried her shotgun with the confidence of someone who'd finally decided to stop hiding. "Is it finished?" she called out as they approached. "It's finished," Boone replied. A cheer went up from the group. Not celebration exactly, but the sound of people who had lived in fear finally allowing themselves to believe they were free. Over the next 3 days, as Willow Creek slowly came to terms with its liberation, and the extent of Voss's network became clear. His lieutenant Dutch Penrose was found dead in the chapel ruins, apparently killed in the explosion. The corrupt sheriff had fled in the middle of the night, leaving behind only a hastily scrawled resignation. Even the town's crooked mayor had disappeared along with several prominent merchants who had been part of Voss's protection racket. But not everyone ran. Many of the townspeople stepped forward to help rebuild what Voss had destroyed, offering testimony to territorial authorities about crimes they'd been too frightened to report before. It was as if the explosion at the chapel had blown away more than just stone and timber. It had shattered the web of fear that had held the entire community captive. Boone spent those days collecting witness statements and preparing his report for the territorial marshal. The bounty on Voss would be paid, but somehow the money seemed less important now. Every time he looked at Josie, really looked at her, saw the way she was slowly emerging from her shell of trauma, he found himself thinking less about his next target and more about what it might mean to have a real purpose again. On the morning of the 4th day, he found Elena and Josie in the town's small cemetery, kneeling beside a fresh grave. The wooden cross bore a simple inscription, "Emma Sawyer, age, 8, beloved daughter." Annie wanted her properly buried, Elena explained softly, with words said over her and flowers on her grave. She'd been lying in an unmarked spot by the creek for 3 years. Boone knelt beside them, adding his own handful of wildflowers to the small pile accumulating at the base of the cross. "What happens now? Now we live," Elena said simply. "We find somewhere safe, somewhere Josie can grow up, without fear, somewhere we can—" She hesitated, as if afraid to voice the hope growing in her heart. "Somewhere we can be a family," Boone finished. She looked at him, then really looked, studying his scarred face with those intelligent dark eyes that had seen too much but somehow retained their capacity for hope. "Is that what you want?" she asked quietly. Before Boone could answer, Josie tugged on his sleeve. When he looked down, she pressed something into his hand, a piece of paper folded small and worn soft from handling. He unfolded it carefully, revealing a child's drawing done in charcoal on brown paper. It showed 3 figures standing together, a tall man with a hat, a woman in a long dress, and a small girl between them. They were holding hands, and above them, she had drawn a sun with a smiling face. At the bottom, in careful letters, were the words, "My new family." Boone felt something crack inside his chest, some wall that had been holding back emotions he thought were dead and buried with his daughter Sarah. "When did you draw this?" he asked, his voice rough. "Last night," Josie whispered. "I dreamed about us being together, being happy." Elena reached over and took his free hand, her fingers intertwining with his scarred ones. "Boone, we don't have to decide everything right now. But if you really want, we could try. Together." He looked at the drawing again, at the simple representation of hope and belonging that a traumatized child had managed to create from the ashes of tragedy. Then he looked at Elena. This remarkable woman who had survived hanging reinvented herself as a nun and risked everything to save an innocent child. Finally, he looked at Josie, whose pale blue eyes held trust instead of terror for the first time since he'd met her. "Yes," he said simply. "I want that more than anything." That afternoon, they boarded the stagecoach that would take them to the railroad station in Tucson. From there, they would travel to San Francisco, where Elena had contacts who could help them establish new identities and start fresh. As the coach pulled away from Willow Creek, Boone looked back one last time at the town that had been Voss's kingdom of fear. Smoke still rose from the ruins of the chapel. But it was clean smoke now. The townspeople had been burning the debris, clearing the ground for something new. Annie Sawyer stood in front of her saloon, which she'd already announced would be converted into a boarding house for travelers. She raised her hand in farewell, and Boone touched his hat brim in return. "Any regrets?" Elena asked as the town disappeared behind them. Boone considered the question seriously. 3 weeks ago, he'd been a broken man, living from bottle to bottle, hunting other broken men for money that never seemed to fill the emptiness inside him. Now he was sitting in a stagecoach with a woman he was falling in love with and a little girl who called him Papa in her tentative whispers. "None," he said, and meant it. The journey to San Francisco took 2 weeks, but they were the most peaceful 2 weeks Boone had experienced in years. Josie's voice grew stronger each day as her confidence returned. She asked endless questions about everything they saw: mountains, desert flowers, other travelers, the mechanics of railroad engines. Elena answered them all with infinite patience, clearly delighting in the child's curiosity and intelligence. On their last night before reaching the city, as they camped beside a clear mountain stream, Josie made an announcement that surprised them both. "I want to keep the name Calder," she said, looking directly at Boone. "But I want to be Josie Calder, not Josephine." Josephine was the scared little girl who couldn't talk. Josie is who I am now. Josie Calder it is. Boone set his throat tight with emotion. "If that's what you want." "It is. And I want Elena to be Mama Calder, not Sister Magdalena anymore." Elena laughed, the sound bright and free in the mountain air. "I think I can manage that. Though I'll have to learn how to be Elena again. It's been a long time since I was just myself. We'll figure it out together." Boone said, pulling them both close as the stars came out overhead. All of us. San Francisco proved to be everything they'd hoped for. Big enough to disappear and civilized enough to offer Josie proper schooling, and diverse enough that a former bounty hunter, an ex-outlaw, turned nun, and a traumatized child could blend into the crowd without attracting unwanted attention. Elena's contacts helped them establish themselves quickly. Boone found work as a security consultant for banks and businesses, using his skills to protect rather than hunt. Elena opened a small clinic in one of the city's poorer districts, treating patients who couldn't afford regular doctors. And Josie bloomed like a flower, finally given proper soil and sunlight. 6 months after their arrival, Boone Calder married Elena Ward in a small ceremony at the city courthouse. Josie served as their witness, wearing a new blue dress that matched her eyes and carrying a bouquet of wildflowers she'd picked herself. The judge who performed the ceremony commented afterward that he'd never seen a happier family. That night, as they sat together in their small but comfortable house overlooking the bay, Josie presented them with another drawing. This one showed the same 3 figures, but now they were inside a house. The man and woman sat at a table while the little girl stood between them, and all 3 were smiling. Above the house she'd drawn not just a sun, but also stars and a moon, a complete sky full of light. At the bottom, in letters that were getting steadier every day, she'd written, "Home." "Are we really home now?" she asked, looking between her new parents with eyes that held only hope. Elena reached across the table and took both their hands in hers. "We are," she said firmly. "We really are." Boone squeezed their joined hands, feeling a peace he'd never thought possible settle into his bones. Outside fog was rolling in from San Francisco Bay, wrapping the city in its cool embrace. But inside their little house, 3 people who had found each other in the darkness sat together in the lamplight, sharing the comfortable silence of those who had finally come home. Later that evening, after Josie had been tucked into bed with a story and a kiss, Boone and Elena sat on their front porch watching the city settle into sleep. The lights of San Francisco spread out below them like fallen stars, and somewhere in the distance, a ship's horn sounded its lonely call. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we hadn't found each other?" Elena asked quietly. Boone thought about it, remembering the hollow man he'd been just months ago, drinking himself to death in anonymous saloons, hunting other men's nightmares while running from his own. "I try not to," he admitted. "But sometimes I think about Sarah, my daughter, about how she'd be Josie's age now if she'd lived. And I wonder if maybe this is what she would have wanted for me. To find another little girl who needed a father, another woman who needed someone to stand with her against the darkness." Elena leaned against his shoulder, her warmth chasing away the evening chill. "Maybe the people we've lost never really leave us. Maybe they just change form, become the love we give to others, the protection we offer, the chances we take on hope instead of fear." That's a beautiful thought. It's what keeps me going. The idea that Miguel's kindness lives on in the way I treat my patients, that your daughter's memory lives on in the way you protect Josie, that even the good parts of what we used to be can find new purpose in who we're becoming. A year later, they were still in San Francisco, their little family grown into something neither of them had dared dream possible. Josie was thriving in school, her quick mind and determined spirit making her a favorite among teachers and classmates alike. She'd taken up drawing lessons and had discovered a talent for capturing not just images, but emotions on paper. Elena's clinic had expanded, and she was training other women in basic medical skills, creating a network of healers throughout the city's immigrant communities. Her past as Sister Magdalena had taught her that sometimes the best way to help people was to give them the tools to help themselves. Boone had been offered a position as a deputy federal marshal, but had turned it down in favor of private security work that kept him close to home. He'd discovered that protecting people he cared about was infinitely more satisfying than hunting people he didn't know. On the anniversary of their wedding, and they returned to Willow Creek for a visit. The town had transformed beyond recognition, prosperous, peaceful, with new businesses opening and families moving in to take advantage of the opportunities. Annie Sawyer's boarding house was booked solid with travelers, and she'd expanded to include a restaurant that served the best food between Tucson and El Paso. They visited Emma's grave again, now part of a well-tended cemetery with proper headstones and carefully maintained grounds. Someone had planted rose bushes around the perimeter, and the whole place had an air of peaceful remembrance rather than tragic abandonment. She would have liked this, Annie said, joining them at Emma's grave. She always loved flowers. Tell us about her, Josie said quietly. What was she like? Annie's face lit up with the joy of a mother given permission to share memories of her lost child. She told them about Emma's laugh, her love of singing, her habit of collecting pretty stones and arranging them in patterns around their small house. As she spoke, Josie listened with the intense attention of a child who understood what it meant to lose parents and gain new ones. When Annie finished, Josie knelt by the grave and carefully arranged a circle of smooth river stones she'd collected during their journey. In the center, she placed a single white rose. Now she has pretty stones again, she said simply. Annie knelt beside her, tears streaming down her weathered face. Thank you, sweetheart. That's perfect. Their last stop was the site where the chapel had once stood. Nature was already reclaiming the land, wildflowers growing through the scattered stones, saplings taking root in what had once been Voss's final stronghold. It was hard to believe that such a peaceful meadow had been the scene of such violence. Do you think about him? Elena asked as they stood in the center of the clearing. About what he became, what drove him to such darkness. Boone considered the question seriously. Sometimes. I think he was a man who let his fear turn him into the thing he was most afraid of, becoming weak, powerless, forgotten. So he tried to make himself strong by making others weak, powerful by making others powerless. But real strength. He looked at his wife and daughter, these two remarkable people who had survived unimaginable trauma and chosen hope over hatred. Real strength is what you and Josie have shown. The courage to trust again, to love again, to build something beautiful from the ashes of something terrible. Josie walked to the edge of the meadow and picked an armful of wildflowers, the same kinds that now grew where the chapel's altar had once stood. She brought them back and scattered them in a wide circle around where they stood. This is for everyone who got hurt, she said solemnly. So they know they're remembered, and so the bad things that happened here can't grow anymore. As they rode back toward town that evening, Boone reflected on the strange paths that had brought them together. A bounty hunter seeking justice for the murdered, a former outlaw seeking redemption for her sins, and a traumatized child seeking safety in a dangerous world. By any reasonable measure, they should never have found each other, much less become a family. But maybe that was the point. Maybe the best things in life were the ones that made no sense on paper, but perfect sense in the heart. Maybe love wasn't about finding someone who completed you, but about finding people you wanted to complete, to stand with, to protect, to share both burdens and joys. The stagecoach that would take them back to California waited at the station, its driver checking harness and gear in the fading light. As they climbed aboard for the journey home, Josie settled between her parents and pulled out her latest drawing. This one was different from the others, more complex, more detailed. It showed not just 3 figures, but an entire community. There were the 3 of them in the center, but around them were other people. Annie with her kind face, the judge who had married her parents, Elena's patients at the clinic, Boone's colleagues, Josie's schoolmates and teachers. It's everyone who helps take care of us, she explained, pointing to different figures in the drawing. And everyone we help take care of too. That's what family really is, isn't it? Not just the people who live in your house, but everyone who makes your life better and everyone whose life you make better. Boone looked at the drawing. and then at his daughter's earnest face, and felt his heart swell with pride and love. In all his years of hunting dangerous men and living with violence, he'd never encountered wisdom as profound as what this 8-year-old girl had just expressed. "That's exactly what family is," he said, pulling both his girls close as the coach began to move. "And we're lucky to have such a big one." As they rolled through the desert darkness toward their future, the three of them dozed against each other, comfortable in their shared warmth and security. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human suffering, but somehow blessing human resilience. In the distance, a coyote called to its pack, and somewhere else, an owl answered with its own lonely song. But inside the coach, there was only peace, the peace of people who had found their place in the world and each other. The last thing Boone remembered before sleep took him was Josie's small hand in his warm and trusting, and Elena's steady breathing against his shoulder. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to protect and serve, and build something lasting. But tonight, they were simply a family traveling home together, carrying with them the hard-won knowledge that love could indeed triumph over fear, and that even the darkest chapters could have bright endings. When the coach pulled into San Francisco 3 days later, where they were met by friends and colleagues who had missed them, patients who needed Elena's care, and neighbors who had become part of their extended family. As they walked up the hill toward their little house overlooking the bay, Josie skipping ahead, while Elena and Boone followed hand in hand, they carried with them not just their luggage, but also their memories, both painful and joyous, their hopes for the future. The house welcomed them back with familiar sights and smells, sunlight streaming through windows that looked out over a city full of possibilities. As they unpacked their few belongings and settled back into their routines, each of them felt the deep satisfaction of people who had traveled far, but were glad to be home. That evening, as had become their custom, they sat together at their kitchen table for dinner. The meal was simple bread, cheese, fruit from the market, but it was shared with love and gratitude. As they ate, they talked about their trip, about Willow Creek's transformation, about their plans for the days and weeks ahead. When dinner was finished and the dishes washed, Josie presented them with one final drawing, one she'd worked on during the long coach ride home. This one showed their house on its hill with the three of them visible through the lighted windows. But surrounding the house, stretching out in all directions, was a vast network of connected lines, reaching toward other houses, other people, other lights, in the darkness. "It's our family," she explained, pointing to the web of connections. "All of it. Everyone we love and everyone who loves us, all connected together like roots under the ground or stars in the sky." Boone studied the drawing, amazed once again by his daughter's ability to see truth so clearly. The lines she'd drawn weren't just artistic decoration. They were a map of relationships, of care and responsibility and mutual support. They showed how 3 damaged people had become part of something larger than themselves, how their healing had contributed to the healing of others, how their love had grown to encompass not just each other, but their entire community. "It's beautiful," Elena said softly. "And it's true. We're not alone anymore, are we?" "No." Boone agreed, folding the drawing carefully and placing it with the others they'd collected over the months. "We're not alone." Later, after Josie had been tucked into bed and kissed goodnight, Boone and Elena sat together on their front porch, watching the lights of San Francisco twinkle like earthbound stars. The fog was rolling in from the bay, bringing with it the salt smell of the ocean and the promise of another peaceful night. "Any regrets?" Elena asked, echoing the question from their first journey away from Willow Creek. Boone considered it seriously, thinking about the path that had brought him here, the years of violence and hunting, and the bottle-blurred nights of trying to forget his failures, the cold morning when he decided to track one more killer in hopes of finding some kind of meaning. "Just one," he said finally. Elena looked at him with concern. What's that? I regret that it took so long to find you both. I regret all the years I wasted being angry and bitter and alone when I could have been this. He gestured toward their house, where Josie slept safely in her own room, surrounded by books and drawings and all the evidence of a childhood reclaimed. I regret that Sarah didn't get to meet her little sister, that she didn't get to see her father learn how to be happy again. Elena took his hand, her fingers intertwining with his scarred ones. Maybe she did see it. Maybe she does see it. Maybe the love we don't get to give one person finds its way to someone else who needs it just as much. You think so? I hope so. I have to hope so, or the world would be too sad to bear. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the distant sounds of the city settling into sleep. Somewhere in the house behind them, Josie stirred and murmured something in her dreams, words of contentment rather than fear, Boone was glad to note. What happens next? Elena asked quietly. What do we do with the rest of our lives? We live them, Boone said simply. We get up every morning and take care of each other and the people who depend on us. We help Josie grow up strong and kind and brave. We build something lasting and good. And when the time comes to account for our lives, we hope we've done more good than harm. That sounds like a worthy goal. It's the only goal that matters. As the fog completed its nightly embrace of the city, wrapping their neighborhood in cool gray silence, Boone Calder closed his eyes and allowed himself to feel something he'd thought was lost forever. Complete and utter peace. Not the peace of the grave or the peace of forgetfulness, but the peace of a man who had found his purpose and embraced it fully. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to protect and serve and love. There would be difficult days ahead, moments of doubt and fear and uncertainty. But tonight, sitting on his front porch with the woman he loved while their daughter slept safely inside, Boone Calder was exactly where he belonged. The former bounty hunter, the reformed outlaw, and the traumatized child had become something none of them could have imagined alone. A family complete and whole, and unbreakably bound by choice rather than blood. They had faced the darkness together and emerged into the light, carrying with them the knowledge that love was indeed stronger than fear, hope, more powerful than despair, and home more precious than any treasure. In the distance, a ship's horn sounded across the water, calling to other vessels in the fog-shrouded night. But Boone Calder was already home, surrounded by his own lights in the darkness, blessed with the greatest treasure of all people, who needed him as much as he needed them, and the chance to spend the rest of his life proving worthy of their trust. As the fog settled over San Francisco like a gentle benediction, three people who had found each other against all odds slept peacefully in their little house on the hill, dreaming of tomorrows filled with purpose and joy and the endless possibility of love.